Oh my gosh, our next speaker is going to have his hands full trying to follow that presentation. Thank you so much, Nancy and Nina. Just your vulnerability, your candor was just unprecedented. Thank you. So next, it is my greatest pleasure to introduce this year's keynote professional speaker, Dr. Alan Frizzetti. Dr. Frizzetti is an internationally recognized researcher, teacher, and supervisor in dialectical behavior therapy. And he's the incredible DBT supervisor behind the 3 East programs at McLean Hospital. He's also co-creator of the Family Connections course offered through NEABPD. He's an unrelenting advocate for individuals affected by borderline personality and their families. In many ways, Dr. Frizzetti brought family members into conversations about borderline personality disorder, and he's been vital in ensuring family members have a voice. This year, Dr. Frizzetti will be sharing about some of his cutting-edge research on how family members of individuals with BPD might be affected by their loved ones' behaviors. This year's keynote speaker, Dr. Alan Frizzetti.
Thanks so much, Emily, and the entire Yale and NEAPBD group for inviting me and for putting this wonderful conference on for the 17th time. I remember back when this was just getting started by Doctors Seth Axelrod and Perry Hoffman, and I've been really delighted to participate or just attend this conference most of the time over the last 17 years. So indeed, it's a hard act to follow Nina and Nancy, but fortunately I know Nancy and I know a little bit about their story, and they are wonderful people. And actually, what they spoke about is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of suicide attempts and self-harm, non-suicidal self-injury, on family members in particular, and not just what the problems are, but also start to think about very concrete and specific solutions that might make things better for family members, and of course, in turn, might make things much better for the person suffering with suicidality or non-suicidal self-injury. Okay, so let's see. I just have to figure out how to change my slide here. There we go. No. No. There we go. Okay. So first of all, let's just start at the beginning. That suicidality and self-harm represent excruciating pain and suffering for people who are suicidal and self-harming. Family members and other people who love them often suffer along with them. And this suffering can take similar forms. Of course, it's painful to love somebody who's suffering. And when we don't understand that suffering could be of different emotions, it's not just empathy. It could be anger, it could be confusion, it could be hopelessness. And so both people who are suicidal and people who love them need a lot of help, a lot of love, and a lot of care. So this is a huge problem. I just want to be clear. 1.2 million people attempt suicide every year in the United States, roughly speaking. And of course, these 1.2 million people have parents and siblings and partners and spouses and children and friends. And so the suicide attempt and can have a massive impact on people around them. Similarly, somewhere between 15 and 38% of youth engage in non-suicidal self-harm at least once. And the numbers there have been growing for decades. And of course, these millions of youth in particular, and young adults in particular, also have parents and siblings and grandparents and aunts and uncles and teachers and friends who are affected by this. And of course, how they respond feeds back and has an impact on them. We just heard Nina talk about early on what the impact for her was upon disclosing about self-harm and how invalidation made that worse, and how later validating made it better. So we're going to get there later. But for now, I just want to emphasize that the scope of this problem is very large. I also want to emphasize that both suicidality and non-suicidal self-harm are transdiagnostic. We're talking specifically about borderline personality disorder, but these problems are not limited to people with borderline personality disorder, and people with borderline disorder almost always meet criteria for multiple other problems. So we tend to think about this transdiagnostically. These are problems, not specifically diagnoses. So as we get into that, I just want to start with one basic assumption, which has been held up by data over and over again, which is number one, suicidality and non-suicidal self-injury affect family members, and family members have an impact back on suicidal and self-harming people. There's no way around that. Now, to paraphrase one of my favorite sages and psychological experts, Yoda said, fear can lead to the dark side. And fear actually is right in the middle of what we're going to talk about today, because fear can lead to all kinds of maladaptive reactions in people who are around suicidal and self-harming people. So we're going to come back to that, but keep that in mind for just a moment. All right, so what I want to do, the big picture here, is I'm going to identify 5 of the biggest problems that family members have, but I don't want to stop at identifying them. I also want to, for each one, identify very real-world, practical solutions that we can work on, things that we can do to reduce the impact of these problems on family members. And in turn, of course, that's going to reduce the impact, the negative impact on our loved ones who are suicidal or self-harming, or maybe actually can help them along. All right, so here are the 5 problems I want to identify, and I'll just highlight them here, and then I'm going to take each one in turn. Burden for family members, distress and burnout, stigma, stress and trauma, and loss of connection to their loved ones. These are big problems. They operate across different levels of analysis for the person, psychologically, emotionally, and with attention, but also interpersonally within their family, but socially with stigma, and culturally with the kinds of invalidation that sit in the background for anybody who's just a little bit different than the norm, where background invalidation can have a profound impact on how comfortable people are in their own skin. All right, so let's start with this idea of burden. Burden might be psychological, financial, it might be in family relationships, it might have something to do with the impact of having a suicidal child on their siblings or on partners, on grandparents, within the family. Financial burden is enormous. In the United States, about 62% of bankruptcies in the United States are a result of medical bills, a very significant proportion of them being medical bills related to mental health care. The United States is the only the only high-income country that doesn't have some kind of single payer system for everybody. And of course, that provides all kinds of complications for families. It's expensive to get treatment, even when treatment is available. It's often not available, and it's often not available differentially by income, by race, by geographical location, or simply by insurance status. And these have real implications for burden for parents and partners and other loved ones. The problem isn't that providers aren't working hard. Providers are working very hard. They're very dedicated, but our mental health systems are overwhelmed. For example, if you compare in the United States, the number of, say, psychologists who work in primary care settings compared to countries that are actually at the top of the list of mental health outcomes, and the US is at the bottom among high-income countries, There are 3 times as many psychologists and psychiatrists, mostly psychologists, working in primary care settings, early intervention, sometimes even prevention. We have that very, very little in the United States. So here's the idea. If I kept going, and I could keep going about this for a very long time, it could lead to despair. Instead, I want to think about a different word that begins with D. I want to think about determination. Like, let's all band together and be determined to change this. Because actually, together, we can make a difference. We need to advocate for access to individual and family interventions so that they're not affected by income, race, geography, or insurance. They just have to be available to people. And they have to be available early for prevention and early intervention. Supposedly, mental health parity exists, but it's no one actually who's ever tried to engage the mental health system thinks that there's real parity in mental health treatment systems, along with other medical systems. We also spend a lot of money on treatments that don't have evidence, and we should be putting more and more of our resources, our very meager resources, into treatments that actually have evidence that they work, along with earlier intervention and prevention exercises. All of these things can make an enormous difference for families, for individuals, for communities, for schools, for teachers, for all of the people that are affected by suicidality and non-suicidal self-injury, and of course, for those people who are struggling with suicidality and self-harm themselves. All right, a second problem I want to highlight is distress in the form of depression, anxiety, substance use problems, burnout, other kinds of mental health problems in family members. It turns out that, well, there are lots of problems that family members have, parents and partners have. It's difficult, it's painful sometimes. There's grief and there's loss, there's low self-esteem, there's burden of guilt and shame and self-judgments and being blamed by other people and precious little opportunity for joy. So I want to walk through a whole series of different things that we can do to reduce or prevent this kind of distress for parents, partners, and others. The first one is this is the set of solutions I'm going to walk through. There are 5 of these. Now, you might think, okay, taking care of our physical well-being, our attention, positive emotions, managing negative emotions like grief and sadness, and then promoting good emotional health with good emotional intelligence. These might seem obvious, but actually we get farther and farther away from best practices in emotion management and attention management and physical well-being. We get farther and farther away from these things as stress and burden go up. So let's look at each one of these in turn. My guess is most of you know many of these things, and most of us could benefit from practicing these things more diligently. So first of all, let's just think about our body, our physical self. Now, our physical self is pretty important for lots of obvious reasons, not least of which is that if we don't take care of ourselves, we develop medical problems, and that presents a whole new burden, right? That was number 1. But now we're on number 2, emotional and psychological distress. Treating physical illness alleviates other kinds of stress. Eating well, sleeping enough, exercising enough, getting enough relaxation, enough leisure, and doing enough physical self-care to actually build wellness. Our bodies house our emotions, and they house our thinking. And of course, they're the position from which we act. And so starting very fundamentally on our physical well-being is absolutely essential. The problem for family members is that I talk to every day is, I don't have time for this. I'm too stressed to do this. It's too difficult. I have to do blank. Well, I totally understand, and I don't want to be invalidating of that. And the idea is not to necessarily take more time to do these things, but to integrate these things into our daily habits and to think about which one of these is maybe responsible for most of our distress or the lion's share of some distress that I'm having today or this week. What would actually help feel better? What's making me vulnerable to all that stress and all that tension? And then start to work on one of these, whether that's going for a walk or sleeping better in some way, going to bed earlier, or attending to sleep, or doing more leisure activities, or eating in a more balanced way, whatever it might be, to really get committed to doing something on this list. So that's one place to start. Another has to do with purposefully managing what we pay attention to. All right, now that might sound like a funny idea. What do you mean? Don't we do that all the time? The answer is no, we actually don't. So I want to draw a distinction between purposeful management of our attention, where we make decisions. I'm going to pay attention to this right now, as opposed to getting hijacked by something out in the world, or a thought in our head, or a memory, or a worry, or something else that hijacks our attention, and then we aren't paying attention on purpose anymore. The thing is that repetitive stress and living with people or being close to people who are really struggling with suicidality and self-harm is stressful. It can result in repetitive distress, right? You bump into something that's distressing, we have stress, we have pain, emotional suffering, and then sometimes we bring that with us and then miss something else that we could be doing with our mind, with our attention. Anybody ever eat lunch and at the end of lunch think, wait a minute, my plate is empty, where did it go? Or you went for a walk and you're not quite sure where you went or how you got there, or you drove home from work and you remember leaving work and you're arriving at home and somehow you did it safely enough, but here you are. That's getting hijacked, okay? Our attention's going someplace else, but not because we want to pay attention to it. So we need to choose what we consume. Now, what I'm talking about here in consumption is not just eating. It's what we consume with any of our senses, what we look at, what we listen to, what we pay attention to. If you have the news on in the background most of your waking day, it's not surprising that you would feel frazzled and distressed, because you're being bombarded with background distressing things of all kinds. And it's not 100% clear that we benefit from bombardment of those things. I'm not suggesting to not be informed. In fact, of course, one can be informed, but one can choose when to pay attention to the news and what news and what do we want to do with it, and then pay attention to something else. We need to be vigilant about our attention and keep it in the present moment. Another way we get hijacked, by the way, is by a memory, something that happened before. Well, something that happened before, guess what? It could give us emotions that are very similar to what happened before. If I was hit by a car on my bicycle a few weeks ago, and I think about it, I could have a lot of fear. And that fear could last for a while I'm making dinner or eating dinner with my family or doing something else. That fear is permeating my awareness and resulting in distress. But in fact, that happened weeks ago, and I'm perfectly safe right now. Maybe I'm in my house or I'm at work, and I'm not being hit by a car right now. Fear is not justified right now. So staying in the present is very different than getting hijacked by the past. Or maybe you're somebody who's worried about the future, right? You're thinking, what if my loved one makes another suicide attempt? What if my loved one self-harms again? Very scary thought, right? And then you have to ask yourself, I hope you'll ask yourself, is that happening right now? Is there present risk at this moment? And most of the time, the vast, vast, vast majority of the time, it's not dangerous right now. By the way, other things could happen in the future too. Like your loved one might not make a suicide attempt this weekend, might not self-harm this weekend. In fact, you know, think about it. What are the chances? I don't know, right? It could be 50-50, but it could be 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000. I don't know. But nevertheless, it's not happening right now, as far as we know. So enjoy the fact that fear is not necessary or helpful right now. Now, I'm going to come back to this issue with fear and other emotions because we've got to learn how to trust the emotions that direct our attention effectively and how to essentially ignore emotions that are not calibrated well. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. All right. It's also extremely helpful to build positive experiences. Now, everybody knows this, right? It's a little bit, you hear about it being like putting money in the bank, right? If you have positive experiences, you've got some buffers, you've got some resilience so that when something unpleasant happens, there's something in the bank. It doesn't cause as much distress. Now, there are two big ways to do this. One is to do old, enjoyable, comforting things that have, generally speaking, almost always been pleasant. And then we have to bring our attention, bring our mind with us, right? Again, if you go for a walk and you're paying attention to churning over the stress of the day, your body's getting some exercise. That's nice. That's good. That's helpful. And your mind is not getting a break. You're not actually building a positive experience. Bringing your mind on with you, bringing your attention with you on the walk can make a big difference because then our emotions are getting a break. Our emotions are getting soothed. We can also do new things of any kind, whether they're physical activities, social, recreational, or just ordinary mundane things, and bring our curious mind with us, right? Soak it in. What's this? What's this like? It's a very big world out there, and most of us only come in contact with a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of it. There are so many things to notice, so many things that we could have an interest in, curiosity about, and then a little bit of joy, a little bit of interest, which, wow, that's such a break from bombardment of fear. The past has already happened. Okay, it's not happening right now. The future hasn't happened yet, and it might not go that way. There are a billion other ways the future could go. So let's stay in the present and pay attention on purpose and enjoy the moment. Now, the next piece here, allowing grief and sadness, is very tricky, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to give it a kind of superficial treatment. The steps are the steps, but they require practice. Now, allowing grief and sadness, you might say, oh, I've already got so much grief and sadness. How can you say allow more grief and sadness? All right, now you might want to reach through your camera and slap me a little bit, verbally, of course. But here's the problem. When we don't like our emotion, we typically try to cut it off. And then we develop almost a relationship to our emotion. We react to our emotions in a negative way, and they keep getting cut off. We don't allow them to rise and fall, which is what emotions do. Our emotion system is uniquely calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years. When something happens, an emotion happens, it gives us information, and then it goes down. That's what emotions do. But if we get in the way of receiving that information and we have an emotion about our emotion, we mess up the whole system. So if we're going to feel sad, the idea is to feel sad. It doesn't have to be for a long time. It might even just be 30 seconds. But let's think about how to do that. So the first thing is sadness and grief show up because there's a cue. Something cues it up. Something happens. Something reminds us that we don't have something that we want, or we've lost something that we had. Okay? That's the tricky thing about sadness and grief. Unlike fear, okay, it might actually be valid for a long time, right? Something that, you might have lost a friend 12 years ago that you still miss. Still not your friend. Maybe the person moved far away, you just don't see them anymore. So that would still be sad. So the question is, what do we do when the cue is there? It's to allow ourselves the sadness. Starts with a cue, reality acceptance, no starting to think about it and analyze it. Oh, if only I had done this, or if only that person had done that. No, 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 no. No blaming, no shoulds, no what ifs, just simply the facts. Right. My friend moved away a long time ago, and I still miss my friend. Okay. All right. Then allow it. As I notice that I'm missing my friend, that's sadness. Allow it to come up. Notice what it feels like. Be curious about it. Maybe breathe in with the emotion coming up and breathe out with the emotion going down, like a wave, because that's what emotions are. They're like a sine wave. They come up and they go down. Now, that is practicing grieving. It's practicing allowing the emotion to come and go. Now, the trick is not to get stuck there, because if we keep paying attention to what we lost, we'll keep triggering another wave of emotion. So the idea is to honor the emotion, a couple of breaths of sadness, maybe more, okay? And then say, yes, it makes sense to have this emotion. Of course I'm sad. Maybe even soothe ourselves, get a cool drink of water. Maybe you go seek validation from somebody else. Say, hey, I was just remembering so-and-so. We were such close friends, and now, we haven't seen each other now in years. And the person says, oh, yeah, that's sad. That's it, right? And then the last slide, right? Then reactivate, create some new, different, positive, go on with the day. What am I doing right now besides feeling sad? Gee, it's a Friday afternoon. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to go do this. And then bring our attention with us, throw ourselves into the right now and move into that. The sadness can come along or it can be left behind, but it doesn't become the focus of our attention over and over and over again, because we have new experiences and new emotions, and relatively speaking, the sadness gets smaller. This requires a lot of practice. Now, in addition, what we're really talking about is emotional intelligence overall, which has to do with what I'm going to call primary emotions. Now, I'm not the first person to call these primary emotions. This is a term, actually, I think that Les Greenberg and Jeremy Safran came up with, 35 years ago, something like that. It's been around in psychology for a long time. The idea is that primary emotions are emotions that fit the moment. They're actually the reason we have an emotion system at all. Think about it. From an evolutionary perspective, we developed emotion to give us information. Long before we had thinking or problem-solving abilities, the emotion says fear, there's danger, whoop, the emotion says run. Okay, when we eventually developed the capacity to think as a species, guess what? Our emotion system still works faster. Okay, but our emotion system doesn't allow us to write a computer program or invent a light bulb. Okay, so there are a lot of good things about thinking. I'm not dismissing them, but our emotion system still works well when our attention is in the present. Okay, it gives us good information and directs our actions. Okay, and some situations there could be more than one primary emotion. All right, now by using the term primary emotion, it's obviously that implies that there's another kind, secondary emotion. What I want to emphasize is that primary emotions are universal, right? Doesn't matter what age you are, what your social group is, what your cultural group, race, geography, doesn't matter. In a dangerous situation, people feel fear. period. In situations, in other situations that are too numerous to describe, we feel love. In other situations of loss, we feel sad. When we've harmed somebody or violated social norms, we feel embarrassed or guilty or even humiliated sometimes, okay? And all kinds of other emotions, all right? Now, those are all primary emotions in the present moment when they make sense, when they're giving us good information. The trouble is, sometimes an emotion can seem like a primary emotion, but it's not giving us good information. Like the example I used before, I got hit by a car on my bicycle, and I feel afraid when I go to the bicycle store to pick up my now fixed bicycle, and I'm too afraid to ride it. Fear is getting in the way. It's not dangerous to ride my bicycle. I could take it on the bike path. It's no more dangerous than it's been for the last, 55 years since I was 7 and started riding a bike. I was something like, I don't remember how old I was. It's no more dangerous. My whole life I've got hit by a car once on a bicycle. Probably not going to happen again, right? But the fear is getting in the way because it happened in the past. Now that is a secondary emotion. My emotion system's trying to give me good information. It's associated my bicycle with danger. My brain hasn't figured out, my emotion system hasn't figured out how to now separate them. And of course, we know how to do that. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So our secondary emotions mean that our emotion system's not calibrated. Now, when people are dysregulated, and we all get dysregulated sometimes, that's always a secondary emotion. Okay. Now, we have lots of secondary emotions that are not at all dysregulated, right? So it's not like secondary emotions are bad. They're not bad, but they're risky. They're a little slippery. And our primary emotions are the things that are actually going to give us good information and inform our actions. Secondary emotions don't fit the facts or the situation or the context right now. And so they're difficult for other people to understand. And we also get invalidated a lot. Because if I'm not going on a bike ride with a friend, it's easy for somebody to say, oh, Alan's being lazy. That's kind of invalidating. Instead of, my fear here, but even Alan's afraid, that is true. It's descriptively true, but it's not the emotion that I need because it's not dangerous. Okay, we'll come back to fear some more. But the idea is, if we're going to reduce our distress, we've got to try to live in our primary emotions and to actually pay attention to, is my emotion, does it fit the situation? Is it helping me? Is it giving me good information? Or is it like a smoke alarm that's just not calibrated right? And I need to say, oh, turn it off. Like, take something and open the door or the window and let some fresh air in and turn off the alarm because it's not dangerous. Okay, now, the third problem for family members has to do with stigma and isolation. Here's the problem. The problem is that in our communities, in our extended families, our neighborhoods, okay, in the workplace, somebody in your family goes to the psych ER and ends up in an inpatient psychiatric ward, okay, what happens? What do people do? Somebody, heaven forbid, somebody in your family gets in a car crash or has to have a emergency surgery of some kinds and ends up in an inpatient medical ward. What does that same set of communities do? They rush to our help. They give us all kinds of emotional and practical support. The psych ER, not so much. And stigma, at its fundamental level, is blame and judgments about things like suicidality and SSI or borderline personality disorder or other mental health problems, okay? And any of these communities, okay, could provide that kind of stigma. Here's what happens. The mental health crisis up in the upper right there starts, and then people get judgmental, they don't understand, When enough people are judgmental, we call that stigma. When it's at a social level, it's stigma. And then, of course, family members feel shame. They feel embarrassed and they feel more distressed. And shame is an emotion that gets us to look away and hide and not talk about what's going on. And so other people don't understand. We don't seek help, and other people don't help us. So we don't get help, continue to unfold, not any better without any help. We have another crisis. The whole cycle starts over again. This is pretty common. So, of course, if we're going to change this, we have to start getting casseroles. Okay. Here's the thing. Some family members said, here's what happens in this situation. Our loved one, our child, our partner, whoever it is, goes to the psych ER or goes to an inpatient psychiatric ward. Nobody brings casseroles. We get no damn casseroles. Right? And that's a great metaphor. Both it's literally true. Your loved one ends up going for emergency surgery. Lots of casseroles show up on your doorstep. Not so much in the psych ER. So in order to reduce this shame and stigma, other people need to understand our experience. So you have to talk about your experience in a non-judgmental way, what it's like for you, your fear, your sadness, your worries, whatever they might be. Are guilt and shame justified? Almost certainly not, right? Look, I'm not saying we don't make mistakes. We do. Everyone does. And that's worth a little bit of guilt to get us to make a repair for our mistake, of course. But for that guilt to grow and fester into shame and stick around, that's almost always a secondary emotion, unless we've done something really outrageously hurtful to somebody. If we stay descriptive and don't judge ourselves or anybody else, other people will begin to understand, and they will eventually, when they do understand, provide a validating response. And of course, they're more likely to bring you a casserole. And if they don't, you can ask for one, because that's what people do. Oftentimes with mental health emergencies, people don't know what to do. And so it's important to say, it would be really helpful if you could give me a ride, or you could bring us a casserole, or if you could just listen for a few minutes. We might have to say what we need. That's okay. That's going to help reduce our shame, because it's going to help reduce other people's stigma. The fourth problem I want to talk about is acute stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, or what we would call over-generalized fear. This is what I was talking about before with the bicycle, right? That fear shows up where it's not justified anymore. It's generalized from getting hit by a car to the bicycle that was present. Now the bicycle is a source of fear. All right, that's a big problem. Now, of course, we're not talking about bicycles here. We're talking about suicide attempts and non-suicidal self-injury. Those are dangerous, but thoughts about them aren't dangerous. Okay? Or maybe you left this person in your family alone for a couple of hours, and that's when they made a suicide attempt. And so now that leaving the person alone at home is really scary. But the vast majority of the time, possibly all the time, that's not dangerous anymore. And so it might be that the fear is overgeneralized. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to do something about that. Now, what we found was pretty interesting and probably won't surprise a lot of people here today. We did a small study, well, actually a big study, 432 people, but it was kind of a one and done study. We just did a survey of family members of somebody who'd made a suicide attempt, somebody in their family or a close person, and nearly all of them, 96.5%, reported experiencing intense fear, helplessness, and or horror in response to the event, which kind of makes sense. That's not surprising. What might be or might not be surprising is that almost half of these people, months and months later, sometimes years later, met criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, where the suicide attempt of their loved one was the index trauma around which they developed PTSD. So in other words, that was very scary months or years ago, but the person is still terrified, is still overwhelmed with fear about this thing that may not have happened in years. And most of the rest, okay, almost half met criteria for PTSD, and most of the rest met criteria for what we call acute stress disorder. All that means is that it's not so long since the traumatic event, okay? And if it's not so long, the person has to be long time before the person meets the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. But if it's a shorter amount of time since the trauma, we call it acute stress disorder. So almost everybody met one or the other criteria. So this is what it looks like. The family members carrying around the past trauma. By the way, this could also be the poor person who's made the suicide attempt, right? But let's say the family member's carrying this around. And then, of course, there's other stuff going on all around us, right? Like bad news. Okay, bad news. Anybody turn on the radio or the television or open up the internet and see any bad news today? And then the pandemic, that had an impact on anybody. And then other daily stressors, weekly stressors, and then something that looks like a minor inconvenience from the outside looks like a minor inconvenience, of course, causes the person to trip and fall down, and other people get invalidating, like you're overreacting. It's not that big a deal. Well, of course, if you're trying to carry all that burden, that's not a small step. That's the point. It's a huge step. And so, of course, you'd trip and wouldn't be able to get up that step. You're too burdened to do it. And so we've got to do something about this over-generalized fear. We've got to reduce it. So the first thing we have to do is we have to notice the present moment right now, right? What's going on in this moment? Okay. Is it dangerous right now? Right now, everybody who has a loved one who's ever made a suicide attempt or self-harmed, can you notice that almost certainly right now, you have no evidence to the contrary, the person is in any danger at this moment, okay? Right this moment. Maybe not in 10 minutes, maybe not tomorrow, but at this moment. This moment, I want you to try to relax and act opposite to the urges associated with fear. Urges associated with fear are either to run away, sometimes, or remember Yoda? Yoda says fear leads to the dark side. The dark side includes anger. It includes trying to control things that we can't control and make a mess of things. Okay. So hands up. Okay. No control, no running away. Just notice it's perfectly safe right now. Relax your body. What else is there to pay attention to? What's going on right now? And let's do that. Let's be balanced. Other things in our life are going on. Okay. And then get active. Back to that, build positive experiences and positive emotions. Okay. And get active and repeat and repeat and repeat until fear goes down. Essentially, we're replacing this fear of the unknown of the future, which we don't know, with curiosity. Do you ever notice that we have a mindset sometimes like expecting the worst thing to happen, expecting something bad to happen? Well, it's possible and things do, but it's also possible that something else will happen. Nobody really sits down on those situations. Yeah, I wonder if, and then picks the most wonderful possible outcome and says, you know what, I'm going to get all happy because that's a possibility. More likely we say, I'm going to get really scared because this other thing is a possibility, when they're both very remote possibilities, okay, on any given moment. All right. The last one, of course, has to do with connections to family members and to others. And this is pretty important. All right. This is taking all the things we've talked about and then putting it all together. All right. So our transactional model, this is a big word, transaction. That just means that what I do affects you, what you do affects me, right? We started out there, a little while ago. So this is what it's like for the person who's suicidal, right? Something happens, that's the green box. That's one source of emotion, okay? They have vulnerabilities. They might be sensitive, reactive. They might be very, Nina talked about being very sensitive. Lots of people are very sensitive, right? being very reactive, having a hard time coming back down once emotions are activated, or just having a high baseline of negative emotion. And then, of course, there's number three, getting judgmental, leaving our primary emotions and getting judgmental, getting stuck in secondary emotions that get bigger and bigger as we judge and blame. Most models stop there and say, yep, that's when people get dysregulated and they make suicide attempts and self-harming episodes. But let's not stop there, because that's only part of the story. The second part of the story has to do with what happens next. When someone's dysregulated, they tend to say things that aren't accurate. They don't say, I'm so sad that this happened at school or this happened at work. They say, so-and-so is a jerk, right? Or you're a jerk, okay? That's not accurate. That's a judgment, okay? And of course, self-harming is not accurate expression either, right? No one who's self-harming is not the way to say, I'm so lonely, okay? People don't understand that. They just see self-harm. They get scared. And then, of course, when someone's not accurate, it's easy to misunderstand and then to invalidate, and that's number four. Wow, that just cranks up the emotions some more. But look here at the bottom, the other person, that's us, okay? That's a parent, a partner, a friend, okay? They have their own judgments. They have their own vulnerabilities. They have their own emotional reactions that make it easier or harder to be invalidating. So all the things we've been talking about so far, reducing stress and burden, reducing negative emotion, reducing fear, reducing stigma, all those help the person at the bottom have lower negative emotion, which makes it much easier not to invalidate. This is what Nancy was talking about. Nancy was talking about working on ourselves, changing our own reactions, managing our own emotions so that we can respond in different ways, so we can understand the experience of somebody else and respond in an understanding way that can then, of course, reduce their negative emotion instead of maybe pushing it up. And of course, number five there just means that when there's enough invalidation, and it doesn't have to be, by the way, from parents or partners or families, it can also be social and background and all kinds of things that makes people more vulnerable. So there's lots of sources here, lots for us to work on. Now, we tend to call this negative reciprocity. This particular transaction, one person who's suicidal and self-harming has an impact on their family member. They get distressed, overwhelmed, and they respond in ways that maybe aren't so helpful, maybe even are hurtful, which actually makes it worse for the person on one side. And what they do makes it worse for the person on the other side, which makes it worse. That's negative reciprocity. What one person does invites a worse response from the other. Now, the reality is we can turn this around. We can take reciprocity and flip it in the other direction. The way to do that using this transactional model is for one person to use accurate expression, to describe instead of judge, to describe instead of blame, so that the other person can understand. And if the other person can understand and doesn't feel blamed, doesn't feel judged, understands the first person's experience, they're more likely to respond in a validating way. And if they respond in a validating way, that's very soothing. And then it's a little easier to be accurate. And then it's a little bit easier to be validating. And then it's even easier to be accurate. And then it's even easier to validate. And all of a sudden, we have a different kind of transaction. Okay. Now, to stay connected, to do this is not easy. There's lots of steps. Nancy said it took a long time. Of course, it takes a long time. First, we have to manage our own emotions. And then we have to, once we're managed and we have the space in our attention, we can bring it to the other person. Bring loving attention, no judgments, just loving attention. Oh, right, this is somebody I love and care about. What's it like to be that person right now? What's it like? And then ask questions. Be curious. Huh, you know, you look really upset. Not you shouldn't be upset, but you are. How come? What happened? What's going on? No judgments, just reality. And then we can understand something, and then we can validate it. And then the other person will actually feel soothed. What we do know, of course, is that validation increases positive emotion in the other person and decreases negative emotion in the other person. We've done several studies on this. It's amazing how quickly this happens and what a big impact there is. Okay, so some quick validating responses, by the way, just to be practical here. It doesn't require, whole paragraphs. They're just things like, I know you feel blank, or I know you want this or that. You seem tired. You seem like you might be upset about something. Of course, right. What happened? Okay, Nina gave us half a dozen great examples of this. What's that like for you? What do you think? That makes sense. Me too. That happens to me too. And let's do what's needed. There are many ways to do this. This is, of course, positive reciprocity. We've turned it around. One person expresses accurately, the other person validates. Wow, now we have a completely different transaction. Okay, so we're going to stay connected by managing emotions, bringing warm attention, validating what's valid, and holding off the problem solving. If we got a problem solved, wait until we can actually talk to each other and do it collaboratively, not jump in and solve problems unilaterally on our own for the other person. All right, so just to summarize where we've been, take care of your body, take care of your emotions, get social support, have more fun, more positive experiences, more time listening and understanding, less time problem solving, validating the people that you love and care about. Okay, I want to stop here. I think there's a few minutes for questions. By the way, lots of evidence for these skills, lots of studies that tell us that the various things that I've just mentioned can have a big impact, not only for the person using the skills for themselves, but for their loved ones.
Thanks so much, Alan. I feel like this relational dynamics part of borderline personality disorder is something that is both so important and one that often gets overlooked in the research. So I really, really appreciate you drawing your attention to it. We've got a couple of questions from our audience that we can kind of jump into. Oh, can you hear me okay, Alan? I can hear Alan. I don't think Alan can hear me. Okay.
I have no sound. Okay.
Sorry, everybody, we're just experiencing some technical difficulties. We'll be back online with Alan in just a moment.
Can you hear us okay now?
I can hear you.
Fabulous, fabulous. Just saying thank you so much for doing this work. These relational dynamics part of borderline personality disorder is so important, and yet one that doesn't really receive the attention it deserves. So thank you so much for drawing all of our attention to it today. We've got time for just a couple of questions before we move into our breakout workshops. So one question that came in was regarding kind of getting validation from other people. What if your loved one with BPD explicitly tells you, don't tell anybody I have BPD, don't tell anybody I'm going into the hospital, I don't want anyone to know that I'm having a hard time?
This is such a tricky situation. So I think that there's, of course, I'm going to answer this by saying, let's think about this dialectically. Let's think about two sides to this. So on the one hand, I would totally want to respect that person's privacy. Okay. So I might take that as saying, I will not talk about this with anybody who knows you. But that doesn't mean that I can't talk about this with somebody. I need to be able to talk about my experience. I'm not going to talk about you, Emily, if you're my loved one, I'm not going to talk about Emily experience. I'm going to talk about my experience with my maybe even unnamed child who's struggling with suicidality.
It's a really good point. And another one, what if, it's another question that came in, what if my loved one's behavior is so off the wall that I can't validate it? What do you do in that context?
Well, the thing about validating is that the idea is to only validate valid things, right? So, if I said, hey, Emily, don't you think my pet dinosaur Ralph here is really cute? You're not going to say, yes, I do, or no, I don't, right? Because there's no pet dinosaur here, right? So what we're going to validate is, maybe I'm having a hallucination, or more likely I'm just teasing. But, we're only going to validate the valid parts, right? So if the person's doing something, I don't know what off the wall is, but there's something valid, like the person's really upset, or is feeling really chaotic, or can't settle down, or is overwhelmed. There's something there that is valid. Just descriptive reality is always valid. So finding something that is valid to validate is the key part.
Awesome. Fantastic. And of course, we are going to come back to Alan at the end of our day today for our panel discussion. So we'll reserve the rest of our questions for them. Thanks so much, Alan.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. Take care.